Ox in the Culvert, written by Gerald, Brence, and narrated by Quippy Quill Production. Chapter 1. Culmar Valley of California, January 1848. The sign nailed to the top of the building read Sutter's Sawmill. James the First Marshal saw it every day. The old man who owned the mill, John Sutter, wasn't around much. He and James had been arguing a lot lately. Captain Sutter, as they called him, made sure Marshall knew that $1 per day meant 10 hours of work at 10 cents an hour. That didn't count taking time for lunch or supper. Marshall had no choice but to adhere to the captain. It was the only work he could find. Late in the afternoon, fog was blowing in from the Northern California range. Marshall was having trouble with rocks and chunks of dirt getting into the saw apparatus's wooden trough. The trash was slowing everything down. The saws would clog and force Marshall to keep shutting the mill down. He had an idea to dig a trench at the front of the mill's runway. As the logs came to the mill, he could stand there and redirect the rocks and dirt with a shovel. He believed the trench current would carry the debris all the way down to the river. Marshall believed it would work, and he had been working on it all day. Marshall was worn out from a rough day's work, and he was in a foul mood. All of a sudden, Captain Sutter showed up. It was just before dark. Sutter had on a big plantation hat. He was fat, and he was smoking a big agar. He used a 5-foot-tall walking stick that had a brass handle. "Marshall, what are you doing down there? Why aren't you in the mill?" he barked. Marshall and Sutter's relationship had become strained. The captain was very impatient with the mill's progress. "I'm digging this trench away from the mill," Marshall told him. "I think it'll flush the rocks and clods out." "That's a stupid idea, boy," bellowed the captain. "Get back up here and do your job. Quit worrying about rocks." The old man's tone insulted Marshall and put him into a rage. He knew what he was doing, and he also knew Sutter wouldn't fire him. Nobody else knew how to run the mill. Marshall had built it himself, and he knew every inch of the operation. He was determined to get the job done, so he decided to spite the captain. Marshall started digging the trench like his livelihood depended on it, because maybe it did. Feverishly, he pushed the dirt with his shovel in an almost perfect groove. He dug a little over 2 feet deep and another 3 feet wide. Pretty soon, the trench ran all the way down into the river. Captain Sutter owned the land for miles around, but he didn't own the river itself. Marshall continued digging. In all, he figured he had dug at least 40 yards. He looked back up the hill where the mill stood. Captain Sutter was gone. It crossed his mind that the old man might actually fire him for being so disrespectful. The thought would keep him up all night long. Captain Sutter expected Marshall to sleep at the mill every night. He was afraid of leaving it unattended for any length of time. Sutter never thought of paying him to sleep there, though. That was just part of the job. It didn't matter. Marshall didn't have anywhere to go anyway. He was just trying to save up enough money to get away from the old man. His bed was on the mill floor. Cotton twill sacks served as his covers. The delivery men would show up early in the morning to haul the lumber back to town. Only 12 planks had been cut today. Marshall had shut the mill down because he was too busy digging the trench. Captain Sutter wouldn't be happy with only 12 boards. He was used to at least 25 to 30 per day. Marshall got up at daybreak and walked down to look at his trench. He walked all the way down to the riverbed. When he got there, he looked back up through the trench to the mill. That was when he first saw it. A shining streak lit up the trench. Marshall didn't understand it at first, but it didn't take him long to figure it out. He grabbed his shovel and started slicing the dirt. The glistening amber metal was plentiful, and it stretched all the way through the trench. It was a fine substance, almost like sand. Marshall looked closer. His senses came alive. As he was trying to figure out what to do, he heard the sawmill delivery men arrive. One man was on a horse. The other man was driving a team of horses that pulled a wagon. Marshall ran 50 yards to meet them. He needed to block them from the mill. "I got no lumber for you today," Marshall yelled. "You can go on your way." The man driving the wagon got angry. "The trip is too far to make without trading goods. I can wait for you to produce if you need more time." However, James Marshall wanted no part of any visitors. "Go on your way," Marshall ordered the men. "I have nothing for you today." 10 minutes later, the men turned the wagon around and left the valley. Marshall watched them until they were out of sight. When he thought it was safe, he ran back to the trench. By then, 4 of Sutter's hired hands had showed up for work. They ran to him. James Marshall knelt down and cupped the dirt into his hands. He looked up at them and calmly said, "Boys, by God, I believe I've found a gold mine." Chapter 2. Melbourne, Australia, June 1851. Few people in the Port Phillip district knew that Lieutenant Governor Charles La Trobe was battling severe depression. He had been thrust into power very unwillingly. Traveling the world was his passion, yet he was stuck in the port area of a chaotic township trying to govern. His district was a wreck. Australia had a gold rush in action similar to what was going on in California. Everyone, it seemed, was dropping all business and heading off to the fields in search of treasure. Of course, only a few were so lucky. However, that didn't stop the throngs of people from leaving the day-to-day duties of city life to head for the search of gold. La Trobe was a tall, good-looking man. He had impeccable character, but his moral values were being tested. Educated back in England, he never thought of being assigned the mundane task of trying to organize a city. He wanted to travel and write books. He didn't want to deal with unruly citizens and outlaws. La Trobe came from an established family back in the old country. It was his duty to serve. That was why he was in Melbourne. What was so disheartening to La Trobe was how much his township had fallen into ruins. It seemed that he couldn't count on anyone to stay in the city and finish any job. The local economy was in a tailspin. Basic services were left undone. Law enforcement personnel was scattered, and crime was at an all-time high. La Trobe had taken it upon himself to police the city. Housing criminals was very expensive and time-consuming. To keep the peace, he had to haul the lawbreakers into the jails to keep them off the streets. He learned quickly that a large sum of money was the only reason a beefy Australian man would serve as a peacemaker. But that was what he had to do, and he did it. The process was costing a fortune. He knew something drastic had to be done to keep the city from going bankrupt, so he made a difficult decision. He decided to deport all criminals from the city jail right into the Pacific Ocean. La Trobe made a deal with one of the most unsavory characters in the region, Cyrus Welch. Welch had lived his entire life in southern Australia. The son of a sharecropper, he had no taste for the farm life. He migrated to the city when he was 15 years old. His goal was to break away from the drudgery of farm work and his father's vicious temper. Welch's first job was as a hand on a cargo ship out of Port Phillip Bay. It was there that he saw he could either be a weak pauper or a wealthy entrepreneur. It was his choice to make. He just had to figure out how mean he needed to be to get what he wanted. He also had to figure out what his moral spirit would allow him to do. That question was answered on his 18th birthday. Welch was working on the dock, loading wheat onto a ship. The foreman, an unfriendly man named Thomas McMahon, decided to slap Welch around a little bit. McMahon, it seemed, thought since he was the boss that he had the power to bully any worker he chose. He carried a whip with him everywhere he went. Welch was in a good mood. It was a Saturday, and he was planning on doing a good bit of drinking that night. He sensed McMahon's attitude as he approached from the far side of the dock. Welch noticed that only the two of them were on site. There were no witnesses around. "Work harder, you scum," McMahon chided Welch. "You worthless as far as me concerned." Welch kept his composure until McMahon pulled out the whip and yelled at him. "I say harder, boy," McMahon yelled. Then the foreman snapped the whip at Welch's feet. Welch immediately pulled his knife, lurched at McMahon, and stabbed him repeatedly up and under the rib cage. McMahon was dead in 10 minutes. Welch gathered his body and deposited it into one of the large grain sacks. He shoveled grain into the sack until it was full. Then he dragged the sack and placed it with the rest of the cargo. The ship would depart later that afternoon. The entire episode took place in less than 30 minutes. Nobody ever heard from Thomas McMahon again. After Welch had tasted murder, he no longer cared so much about the value of human life. Eventually, he worked his way up to foreman. Then he became the company man for a ship owner. Before he knew it, he was in position to buy a ship that had been abandoned in the harbor. One day, La Trobe approached Welch down on the dock. "Mate, would ye be tressed in free labor should I be able to provide?" La Trobe asked. Welch raised his eyebrows. "Yea, I think I would," he answered. That was the day that Cyrus Welch got involved with slave labor. Lieutenant Governor La Trobe had gotten to the point that he didn't care so much about ethics. He and Cyrus Welch made their deal secretly in the lieutenant governor's office. La Trobe just wanted to get rid of the outlaws that haunted the port. He had heard of other government leaders in the region that had made similar deals with ship owners. The plan was simple: shackle the prisoners and take them down to the docks. Tell them they had two options. They could go back to jail, or they could get on the ship. If they chose the ship, they would be released to Cyrus Welch. They just could never come back to Melbourne. The prisoners really didn't have the option of going back to jail. The offer of staying was just a way to pacify La Trobe's conscience. Life in southern Australia was moving too fast to know much about a shipping cargo owner, so Cyrus Welch got a pass on his background. La Trobe wanted as many people as possible to see the prisoners, so he walked them from the jail down to the dock. The shackles on their ankles and wrists scared the bystanders. He knew the value of a strong deterrent penalty. La Trobe had leaked the news to the public, and a crowd had gathered to watch. It was similar to a public hanging. Welch loved the feeling of power that he had over the prisoners, but he knew not to abuse them. He remembered the incident with Thomas McMahon. He would take a different approach. His method would be to treat the men fairly until one of them rebelled. If they threatened his comfort level, the solution to the problem was simple. The prisoner would be thrown off the ship. Welch had knives, shotguns, and handguns. He also had 16 paid men on his ship. The slaves would bring a new dimension to the environment. Welch knew he had to keep both the paid hands and the prisoners down. If they gathered any power, there could be a mutiny. Welch knew the risks, but he was excited about the rewards. Labor was his biggest expense. Now he had a way to work around it. He would turn the prisoners into sailors. He would train them on the voyage. The prisoners were loaded onto the ship. La Trobe felt very uncomfortable about the whole thing, but he stuck with the plan. Suddenly, one of the prisoners realized that he might be on his death walk, and he started to rebel. Welch, the savvy business person that he was, stepped into action. "We have no reason to harm ye," he said. "Work hard, do what ye told, and we let ye go in America." Cyrus had a way of calming everyone down. The shackled man got on the ship, and it sailed away. Things went well the first 2 days. There was nothing close to a mutiny. Slowly, Welch trained the prisoners to sail, but his plan didn't work well. On the second day, the prisoners got very hungry. He had done a poor job planning how to feed them. Welch didn't think of what might happen when one of the prisoners passed out from hunger or exhaustion. There were other problems. The paid men didn't like the situation, and it got testy on the ship. Finally, Welch gave up on training the prisoners and decided to hold them down below. He cuffed them to chains attached to the wall. Welch also realized that he had too many slaves for the trip, so it was then that Cyrus Welch decided to throw 20 of them off the ship and into the ocean. The Melbourne was 500 miles east of Melbourne. Cyrus Welch needed to get to America as quickly as possible. He had to figure out how to put the pieces together. Captured slave labor was the way to go. He just had to think it all through. He had heard of the great gold rush in Northern California. People were getting rich there. He had to get to San Francisco as fast as he could. Chapter 3. Southwest Texas. As usual, it had been a long, hot summer in Texas. Captain Ray Andrews was thinking about his future like he had done 100 times before. He couldn't help but to wonder what was going on out in California with all this gold rush business. Ray had been poor his entire life. He had 10 $1 coins to his name. The coins were kept on his body. He kept 1 coin in his pocket. The other 9 coins were in small bags tucked into his boots. He had been good about saving his money. The 10 coins amounted to the most money he had ever put together at one time in his entire life. He was intrigued by fortune, but he was a very conservative person by nature. Maybe the rumor of people getting rich in California was just cheap talk, but Ray couldn't resist the temptation to at least listen. His best friend and fellow Texas Ranger, Tom Jenkins, wouldn't stop talking about it. They say all you gotta do is ride down into the valley and start digging. We can do that better than anybody, Ray, he said repeatedly. However, Ray knew he was going to have to give Tom the bad news. He wasn't going on any great adventure to California, but they could talk about that later. Right now, he had more serious business. He and Tom, along with 8 other Rangers, were on a mission to protect a payroll wagon to Camp Stockton. There had been some ruthless Indian raids in the area. The Rangers believed the Indians were Apache, but they weren't sure. They could be Comanche. The renegade leader of the band had been identified as one of the most savage Indian leaders in the Southwest. The Rangers didn't know what to call him, so they gave him the surname of Empty Heart. The Scouts knew very little about him, and the Rangers were worried about his legend growing too quickly in far southwest Texas. The only intelligence that the advanced Scouts had offered was vague information about an Indian leader who wore a red feather. He did use guns, and he was a savage in his raids. A month ago, a friendly Indian scout made mention of a small group of what he thought were Apache. He had never seen them before. They looked to be dangerous. When pressed for information, he remembered the leader was wearing a red feather in his hair. That was why the Rangers figured Empty Heart was in the general area. Empty Heart, it seemed, was a master at hiding, planning, and executing his crimes. He was especially brutal. He not only killed his victims, he also dismembered them. He was a cold-blooded killer that could care less about the value of life. After surveying the carnage of one particular slaughter, an officer made the statement that whoever did this has an empty heart. That was the story of why the Rangers gave Empty Heart his name. Ray took a drink from his canteen. It was almost empty. He knew he wouldn't be able to fill it for a while. He and Tom were on top of what the locals called Rosary Hill. The hill was right at 120 miles west of AUS 10. The Rangers strategically picked Rosary Hill because it would allow the small group of men to see from all sides. They felt it was a relatively safe place to camp. Ray and Tom had always competed against each other in their ability to shoot guns. Samuel Colt, the shrewd entrepreneur, had just developed a new handgun. It was a lighter, sleeker version of his 4-pound, 9-ounce 44 caliber Colt Walker revolver that had changed everything in the Indian Wars. Colt's new version was a smaller 36 caliber revolver that weighed less than 3 pounds. On the cylinder, he had elegantly roll-engraved a depiction of an 1843 Texas naval battle with Mexico. He thought he could sell it to the Navy. However, they didn't seem interested. His next target was the Rangers. The gun's accuracy was exceptional and could be aimed to fire at 200 yards. Colt was not only a great gunsmith, but he was shrewd at marketing his goods. A catchy name for his new creation would help sales. He tried a few different names, but his favorite was always the Colt Navy. He needed to test it, so he developed a contest. Both Ray and Tom were at the front of the line to sign up to compete. One of Colt's salesmen brought the revolver to Austin. The 10 best shooters in the contest got one of the guns. They also got an assignment to guard a payroll wagon headed to Camp Stockton. None of the Rangers knew about the Camp Stockton trip when they signed up to win the revolver. The contest was simple. Each ranger got an opportunity to empty the 6 shots in the chamber at a board that was set up 50 yards away. Ray Andrews took first place by hitting all 6 of his shots inside a circle. Tom finished fourth. "Ray, this is a waste of time," Tom Jenkins sneered. "I bet they're just building this engine's name up to scare us. Don't you think?" Tom was looking through his saddlebags for whiskey. "Well," Ray replied, "I don't know about that, but I've been thinking about this gold trip. I'm going to re-up for another year with the Rangers. I'm not going to California." The news jolted Tom Jenkins to the core. He sank his head, and then he rose to his feet. "Well, you go ahead," he said. "I'm going on out there. You can stay here in Texas and starve the rest of your life if you want. All they're going to do is use you until you get killed out in the middle of nowhere. You disgust me, Ray Andrews." Ray had heard it before. Tom never mixed words when it came to emotion. "You don't mean that, Tom," Ray replied. "Yes, I do," said Tom. "I thought we were in this together. You're just a suck-up company man. The Rangers own you and always will. My old man was right. You won't ever amount to nothing." Tom Jenkins's father, William I, owned 2 full sections of land just south of Austin. He was one of the wealthiest men in Central Texas. Tom could go back and live a safe life if he wanted. Ray, on the other hand, didn't have anything. His parents never married. The story Ray had always heard was that his father died in a jail cell after being beaten up in a drunken brawl. Supposedly, that had happened somewhere in Central Texas. At the time, Ray was just 8 years old. His mother, Della, left him with her mother, Ruth and Andrews, in Austin. Ruth was in her 70s when she took in Ray. Tom and Ray met one day when they were kids and had been best friends ever since. William T. Jenkins never liked Ray. He always viewed him as a low-class vagrant. But if the truth were told, it was just the opposite. Tom was the one who always got the two of them in trouble. One of his ideas led to the both of them signing up for ranger duty at age 18. That did it. He always blamed Ray that Tom was a ranger and not a farmer. "We can talk about it later," Ray scolded Tom. "Empty Heart could be out there." Tom snorted. "He ain't out there. Nobody is going to bother us, and you know it." Ray was thinking the same thing, but he wouldn't admit it. This was the 3rd night of the escort duty. They had seen or heard nothing. Ray was worried that some of the Rangers would start taking things for granted. That was a serious mistake when dealing with Indians. He bounced down the hill to check on the men. Strategically, he had placed 2 men in dugout holes on each of the 4 sides of the hill. Hopefully, if Empty Heart attacked, he wouldn't know the Rangers were hiding below ground level. Ray and Tom were at the top of the hill. All 10 Rangers had the new Colt Navy revolvers. Each one could get off 6 shots before having to reload. Placed in pairs, one could load the gun while the other was shooting. Hopefully, any battle would be a huge mismatch in favor of the Rangers. Ray scrambled as low as possible to the north foot of the hill. Billy Terry and Big Scaly Johnson were down in a foxhole. Ray immediately noticed their foxhole wasn't deep enough. "We better dig this hole a little deeper," he said as he jumped down with the men. "Give me your shovel." Nobody in the Texas Ranger organization could push a shovel like Ray Andrews. He mastered the skill as a young ranger out in the Texas fields. In less than 10 minutes, he had dug the trench down another foot. He crawled out onto the prairie and grabbed 3 thistles. By the time he made it back to the hole, Billy and Big Scaly were digging again themselves. "Here, use these thistles to hide your heads. Don't take anything for granted. Take more pride in your cover," Ray said. Ray always believed in leading by example. He never thought twice about doing physical labor. Now he needed to make it to the other 3 foxholes to make sure the men were ready. It was right at dusk, and the weather was threatening. A sharp south wind had escalated. Lightning bolts sparked the skies. The smell of rain acted as a fragrance in the air. Everyone on the hill knew that Indians usually didn't attack at night. Most of them thought that it was against their honor, but this band was different. All the men knew it was at night that they were the most exposed. That was why Ray had set things up like he did. One ranger could sleep while the other watched for Indians. The hill was surrounded with men in foxholes, and Ray was confident they had a huge firearm advantage. Ray had gone to the trouble of ordering all the men to carry huge body shields to protect themselves from arrows. The shields were just round pieces of wood that had been used as trash can lids. Ray had ordered one of the men to attach handles on one side. He had tried to think of everything. The plan was to create an image of 4 men traveling the route. 2 men traveled on the wagon, usually Ray and Tom. The wagon was pulled by a team of 4 horses. 2 other men traveled on horseback with rifles. 6 men rode inside the covered wagon. It was tough duty staying inside the wagon all day in the Texas sun. The Rangers didn't want the convoy to look too heavily armed. If so, Empty Heart would know they had the money. Ray thought the whole mission was a gamble. Nobody knew what might happen, but the payroll had to get to Camp Stockton somehow. Ray fought his way over to the west side of the hill. There was the first Sergeant Cletus Smith. In Ray's opinion, Cletus was the best conger on the mission. He had the weakest ranger, Sonny McGraw, with him. There were plenty of big rocks to help establish cover on the west side. 50, it was easy for Smith and McGraw to set up their post. Cletus had formed a hole in the rock pile to shoot at anyone who threatened. Ray sure hoped any attack would come from the west because that was obviously the most fortified position. Tom Jenkins had already started drinking whiskey. He had a bad attitude about the mission and was taking things for granted. Ray was very frustrated with his best friend, but he knew it wouldn't do much good to argue with him. Being on top of Rosary Hill was the last place in the world Tom wanted to be, and he let everyone know about it. Tom was a talented ranger, but his attitude had gotten the best of him. The California Gold Rush was on his mind, and he had a tough time thinking about anything else. Tom was supposed to check on the south and east flank, but Ray took nothing for granted. He made it all the way around the hill. The south flank was the most exposed. Ray would back it up from the top of the hill himself. Tom was supposed to back up the north flank, but he was wandering all over the hill, drinking and talking. John Wilder, a veteran ranger, was dug in deep. Wilder, it seemed, never slept. He was a family man with 2 kids at home. Ray tried as hard as he could to get Wilder out of the mission. He was the only ranger on the hill who had a family. Wilder's droopy eyes made him look 20 years older than he really was. He realized the danger of a renegade Indian like Empty Heart taking over the territory. With every attack and victory, Empty Heart gained more power. Wilder realized that he had to be eliminated, so he convinced Ray that he needed to go on the trip. Wilder's partner was a young ranger named Will Johnson. Johnson was the second best shooter in the group, only behind Ray. If Johnson got his chance with the new Colt Navy revolver, Empty Heart's tribe could be decimated. Wilder was on edge. "I haven't seen nothing, but I got a feeling somebody's out there," he said as he tore off a piece of beef jerky. "You better get everybody ready, Ray." Ray took anything Wilder said very seriously. Suddenly, his mood became much more intense. The trip had already been long. If anyone was watching, it wasn't hard to figure out that they had something valuable. They probably would be a target for someone. It could be the Indians or Mexican outlaws. The Rangers' reputation had become a bit of a hindrance. If it became known that a group of them was in the area, problems would often scatter. Usually, Rangers went on the offensive chasing villains. Guarding money was not what they were interested in doing. The east side of the hill should be secure. The convoy had traveled from that direction. They had passed an old broken-down barn on the way. It could be a perfect staging area for someone to hide and then attack. The barn had concerned all the men when they passed it in the wagon. Stuttering Henry Jones, the oldest man on the mission, was looking for any sign of life. Stuttering Henry didn't talk much because he hated being the butt of jokes. He had always been the victim of a terrible speech impediment. Often, He used hand signals to communicate. He was not fond of the new Colt Navy, even though he was very good with it. A shotgun was his preference. He had two with him in the foxhole plus the revolver. His partner, Leo Wilson, made up for both of them with his talking. He wouldn't shut up. As soon as he heard the rock hit in front of him, he knew it was the captain. That was how Ray signaled to the men that he was coming around to check on them. "Ray, is that you?" Wilson whispered, "Yeah, it's me. Do you see anything?" Ray responded. Leo and stuttering Henry had their eyes transfixed on the direction of the old barn, which was about 5 miles out. If anyone was following them, the men knew that was where they would hide. It was completely dark now, and the Texas sky was not kind to the Rangers. Lightning bolts seared sideways and provided brief glimpses of open prairie land. The clouds blocked the light that was put out by the stars. That gave away the advantage of being on top of the hill. The darkness was very scary to Leo Wilson. He was sweating profusely. "Ray," Wilson said in a half-whisper, "keep your gun pointed right over my head. If we get in trouble, I'm gonna just slip under this shield." At the very moment he said it, lightning lit up the sky. "What do you think, Stut?" Ray whispered to Henry Jones. "CC concerned," answered Henry. "D don't like that bee-barn out there." Ray stood up and looked in all 4 directions. "Well," he said, "if anything happens, use your best judgment." Ray realized that the men were worried. All of the men except one, Tom Jenkins. Chapter 4. Empty Heart's real name was Soares Aguilar. His mother, Censilla, was captured after a raid on her home Apache tribe by a band of Mexican outlaws years ago. She was sold as a slave to a much-despised man in the Big Bend country named Penny Aguilar Cruz. Penny was a noted criminal. His main source of income was in moving stolen horses from Texas into Mexico. He was also known as a thief that was accused of 3 murders in which he was never officially charged. Censilla was a very beautiful woman. That was the main reason that Penny had bought her. He used her as a sex slave along with many other duties. A son was conceived the year after Censilla was purchased. Penny was fond of the young boy at first, but he quickly became bored. They named the boy Soares. Censilla raised him pretty much alone. She wanted her son to find a way out of the rough life of outlaw living. Soares learned how to speak both English and Spanish. He also learned to communicate well with his Indian mother. Everyone who ever spent any time with him noticed that he was very smart. Soares also had a good demeanor, but he also had a quick temper like his father. One night, Penny rode into Censilla and Soares' camp with his men. He started drinking tequila. One thing led to another. When he slapped Soares, Censilla charged him. She tried to knock him to the ground. Penny pushed her aside and picked up an axe handle with his right hand. Then he hit her over the head with it. He went back to drinking and left her to die right there on the ground. After he gave his mother a proper Indian burial, Soares began to realize what he was, a bastard child of both Apache and Mexican blood. He took only one thing from his mother. Censilla loved the feathers of a bird that was native in the area called the summer tanager. After it became fully grown, the summer tanager's feathers were completely red. She wore the tanager's feathers every day. Soares took every red feather but one. He left that one woven into his mother's hair. He then took one of the feathers and wove it into his own long, black hair. The feather draped across his right shoulder. It looked subtle, but it was very easy for others to see. He would wear the red feather in honor of his mother for the rest of his life. Even though he hated the old man, Soares was forced to ride with him and his unsavory entourage. As the years went by, the younger Aguilar began to pick up some of his father's unsavory habits. Both Penny and Soares liked money, women, and power over others. They argued often, but they tolerated each other. Penny taught Soares how to take advantage of uneducated traders, and he taught him how to intimidate the men who traveled with them. He had already taught him how to kill. Soares never talked much. He didn't trust anyone, especially his father. But unlike Penny, Soares rarely drank, and he was always aware of what was going on around him. He realized by watching the bad example of his boisterous father that blending into the countryside and staying low-key would be a huge advantage. Somewhere along the way, Soares realized that it would be smart to commit his crimes as an Indian. Then he would slip back into his appearance as a Mexican. It was a perfect cover. One night, the gang stopped at a saloon in Juarez. Penny got into an argument with the bartender. All of a sudden, a bouncer came through a door behind the bar carrying a shotgun. Penny immediately became the savvy politician. He explained that everything was fine and everyone should just calm down. Finally, the bouncer lowered the shotgun and pointed it to the ground. As soon as he did that, Penny pulled his gun and shot the bouncer right between the eyes. "Nobody pulls a gun on me and gets away alive," he shouted to everyone in the bar. Then he did something that Soares would never forget. Penny walked over to the bouncer and took out his knife. Then he cut the tongue right out of the dead man's mouth. Suddenly, Soares realized why Censilla was missing a finger at her burial. Penny must have cut it off. Penny Aguilar believed that he had to dismember any murder victim in some way to keep the body's spirit from following him. It was an old superstition that he had picked up somewhere. Soares thought it was odd, but it made quite an impression on him. The Aguilars continued to travel through the deep Southwest for a few more years. Soares grew into quite a bitter man, but most of his differences with people were about money. He, Penny, and the men began to look for caravans to raid and loot. The first person Soares ever killed was an old cowboy that couldn't get a shot off at him from 30 yards away. If the old cowboy's gun would have fired, Soares would have been a dead man. He couldn't do it, so Soares slammed the butt of his rifle against his head. He was dead in an instant. Soares didn't want to waste any ammunition. After his first killing, Soares Aguilar didn't think twice if he had to murder to get what he wanted. However, he was skillful in hiding his reputation. He was smart enough to know that outlaws were tracked by bounty hunters, rangers, and even the army. He often scolded the old man when he got sloppy. Soares believed in operating in secrecy. He once shot one of his own men because he felt that he was too dangerous. He wasn't a threat to Soares physically. It was that he talked too much. Soares felt he would say something to someone who might figure out how ruthless the Aguilars really were. One day, Penny and Soares came across 3 Apache brothers named Morocco, Kele, and Elsu. Soares could communicate with them easily. He and the old man needed manpower. They knew they were probably in for bigger fights ahead. Soares offered the 3 brothers a $1 coin to ride along with him. He had already noticed that they were carrying firearms. 2 of the brothers, Kele and Elsu, had Colt Patterson revolvers. The oldest brother, Morocco, had a shotgun. All 3 carried bows. Soares really liked that. He knew the devastation that arrows caused. All raids were to be split 5 ways. It was a fair deal for all, Soares explained. Morocco, the oldest of the brothers, was skeptical of Soares' skin color. He looked Indian, but his Mexican tone was obvious. It was the way Soares wore his hair that was so confusing. He dressed like a Mexican, but he wore his hair long with a feather like an Indian. The other 2 brothers would do whatever Morocco told them to do. Soares picked up on that quickly. If he controlled Morocco, then he would also control Kele and Elsu. Since the first day they met, Soares had wondered what it would be like if Morocco wasn't around. Soares could be quite convincing if he needed to be. Quickly, he convinced the brothers that he could lead them to more money and guns. That was what they wanted to hear, even though they didn't really know what to do with the money. They figured they could learn that later. The rocky relationship between the Aguilars came to a head over a woman. The gang had stopped at a small saloon in El Paso. Penny was harassing a prostitute who was showing him no interest. Penny wasn't used to that, and it made him mad. Between the tequila and his rage, it was evident that something bad was going to happen. Soares told the old man to back off the woman, but Penny wouldn't stop. The physical violence started. It was more than what Soares could take. He threw the old man off the woman. Penny pulled his gun. Soares knew he wouldn't hesitate to kill his own son, so he dived behind a table and pulled his knife. Penny started firing away. Soares rolled to his right. He jumped to his feet and threw the knife right into Penny's chest. Soares didn't even try to save him. He just sat there and watched him die. It was a cruel reminder of the day he lost his mother. When Soares was sure Penny was dead, his instincts took over. He pulled the hatchet off his belt. A hammer stroke sliced his father's right arm off at the elbow. He had used the hatchet that way before. Soares picked the arm up off the ground and ordered Morocco to load the body onto his horse. Soares and the 3 Indian brothers rode away quickly, leaving little evidence of what had just happened. They stopped on the side of a canyon about 5 miles from town. Their Soares covered Penny's body with rocks. They got back on their horses and rode another 5 miles to a small canyon. Soares instructed Quill to dig a small, shallow grave. That was where they buried the old man's right arm. Chapter 5. Soares Aguilar had no idea that the Texas Rangers had given him the name of Empty Heart. A month ago, roughly 100 miles southeast of El Paso, he had organized a raid on a small group of traveling homesteaders. The attack was so well executed, the settlers had no chance. Soares made sure that Morocco, Quill, and Elsu knew that there would be no survivors. That wasn't just an order from the boss. It was part of the plan. He was smart enough to know not to leave any kind of witness behind. Ranger investigators had observed that arrow marks looked like they had been fired from all 4 directions at the caravan. 7 of the 12 settlers had been hit with extremely sharp arrows. The other 5 had been shot at close range. Every one of the 12 settlers, 10 men and 2 women, had a body part cut off their torso. Mainly it was a hand or a couple of fingers. One man had his forearm chopped off at the elbow. The separated body parts were nowhere to be found. It was a gruesome scene, one that couldn't be explained. The ranger brass believed the attack was based on treasure. There was no money to be found anywhere. Often, Indians left money behind after an attack. Here it was obvious that the killers searched the bodies for every coin. That was the extent of the intelligence that Captain Ray Andrews knew, and it was the reason that he set up the camp the way he did. Ray figured that Empty Heart had access to both bows and firearms, but what worried him the most was the organization of the attack. If and when Empty Heart attacked, what would be his strategy? What did he know? How long would he stalk them? He didn't realize how close he was to receiving the answers to his questions. Soares had practiced long and hard to compete with the 3 brothers as an archer. He had become almost as good as the young Elsu, but he was far behind the other 2 brothers, Morocco and Quill. He positioned himself on the south side of the camp, thinking it would be the least fortified and the easiest to attack on foot. Morocco came in from the west. He was the best archer in the crew. He would have to fire over the rocks. Quill attacked from the north, Elsu from the east. All 4 had 40 arrows. Soares instructed them to fire half of their arrows in the first wave of the attack. Then they were to take their guns and fire directly into the camp. Soares had figured out the angles. He knew how to position the 3 brothers and himself without shooting each other. They had gone over the raid many times. The first arrows hit the campsite right about 3 o'clock in the morning. Soares, Morocco, Quill, and Elsu used the lightning in the sky to help zero in on the target. Ray had made a big deal about keeping the shields close at all times. However, the shields were heavy and awkward. It didn't take long for the Rangers to lose interest in them. That would prove to be a grave mistake. Most of the arrows landed on top of the hill. Ray was under the wagon, taking his break. However, he was wide awake. Tom was supposed to be watching, but he had wandered off somewhere. Suddenly, 2 of the horses were hit and screamed wildly. It started raining arrows at a slow, deadly pace. Ray drew his Colt Navy, but he could see nothing. Then the gunfire started. It came from 4 directions. There were different types of firepower. Shotgun sprays, rifle shots, and handgun fire pierced the campsite. Every horse was hit in the savage crossfire. Then, as quickly as it started, it all stopped. Captain Ray Andrews felt like a sitting duck, so he scrambled on all 4s to a rock pile 30 yards away. "Tom," he yelled, "where are you?" There was no answer. The silence was the worst part. The only sounds came from loud thunderclaps. Ray had accumulated several rocks so he could throw them at the foxholes before approaching. As he was getting ready to throw a rock at the first sergeant's foxhole, he heard Sonny McGraw's voice. "Captain, Sergeant Smith's been hit." Ray scrambled on all 4s down to the rock ledge. There he found his great friend and fellow ranger, Cletus Smith, with an arrow right through the middle of his back. He was dead. It took everything Ray had to fight off the shock. He not only lost one of his best friends, but he also lost his best soldier. McGraw was in a panic. "Quiet down," Ray hissed at McGraw, but it was too late. Another wave of arrows started. This time the trajectory was flat, and one of the arrows hit McGraw right in the face. Suddenly, the arrow barrage ceased. A minute later, the gunfire started again. It was chaos. 5 minutes later, the firing ceased. The west flank was now completely decimated. Both Smith and McGraw were dead. Ray grabbed the Ranger pistols off their bodies. He realized that he shouldn't leave the west flank open to attack. He had cover with the rocks. He also had a lot of firepower. He settled into the rocks the best he could and checked the revolvers. Not a shot had been fired. Once again, the arrows started coming in on the camp. It was a short barrage this time. Ray knew the shooting would start again right after the arrows stopped. When it did start, the fire was much lighter, but he was trapped in the rocks, not knowing what would come next. He sensed the shooting would stop soon, and then it would be quiet again. He was right. Ray decided to run to the top to the hill. A huge lightning bolt ripped through the sky and forced him to duck for cover. When he looked up, he saw some kind of shadow down on the edge of the south flank. He aimed the Colt Navy, and he fired every bullet from one gun. He put the gun down and grabbed another one. Something, man or animal, was running south. He was pretty sure that it was a human being. He aimed, and he fired. It was unclear if he had hit anything or not. Finally, he stopped shooting. The terror of the silence was almost too much for Ray. He ran back to the wagon and crawled underneath it. He was sure another barrage of arrows was coming. He waited. He waited some more. There were no more arrows or fire. It was very quiet. All 6 horses were dead. They were full of arrows and bullets. Ray crawled around the wagon. He jumped into the back and pulled up the plank from the floorboard. His heart sank. The brown saddlebags that were hidden underneath the floorboard were gone. They contained $3,000 worth of paper money and coins for the payroll. Somebody had stolen it all. Ray was so upset that he forgot about being scared. "Wilder, Terry, Stut, where are you?" he yelled. Stuttering Henry Jones popped his head out from the foxhole. "Ray," he said, "I'm here." Billy Terry came crawling up the hill on all 4s. "Here," he screamed at Ray. "Where's Wilder and Cletus?" The 3 men met at the wagon. "Sergeant Smith is dead. So is McGraw," whispered Ray. "Big Scaly is down on lookout," responded Terry. "He's okay." Ray was already looking around the hill for Tom Jenkins. "What about Leo?" he asked stuttering Henry. "He's all right," responded Henry, "down in the hole." Ray called to the men, "Everybody, come to the wagon." Big Scaly and Leo Wilson got up quickly and met the rest of the men. "Where's Wilder and Johnson?" Ray asked in a panic. He ran to the south side of the hill. There he saw John Wilder and Will Johnson both lying in the foxhole. Both men had taken a bullet to the head. Ray looked to his left, and he saw an even more horrifying sight. Tom Jenkins was on his knees. An arrow had gone right through his torso. His body was leaning against a rock pile. His gun belt was missing. He had also been shot multiple times. His boot had been chopped above the ankle, but it wasn't separated from the rest of the body. Whoever was trying to cut it off had failed to finish the job. Chapter 6. 5 men were dead, $3,000 had been stolen, and the 5 surviving men were stranded out in the Texas sun. Ray Andrews was inconsolable. His best friend, Tom Jenkins, was a butchered mess. The last words they shared were very cross. First Sergeant Cletus Smith and Ranger Sonny McGraw had been killed with arrows. John Wilder, a family man that should not have been on the mission, was dead from a close-range gunshot wound to the head. His left hand had been cut off his body. Will Johnson was also shot at close range. He was missing a thumb. At first, Ray wanted to go on the attack. He wanted to take out on foot and try to find the men who inflicted the slaughter. But he quickly came to the realization that he had to deal with 5 dead bodies and 6 dead horses. Then he realized that he had another problem. What about the Colt Navy revolvers? A quick count of the guns brought attention to the fact that whoever attacked the camp also had taken 3 of them. That just made things worse. Captain Andrews decided to bury the bodies on top of Rosary Hill. He led the digging himself as the other rangers took turns watching out for trouble. Ray decided to dig at least 7 feet deep before burying the bodies. There was no way he was going to let animals get to his men. He would use rocks to mark the graves. That way, they could be easily found. The 5 rangers dragged the horses to the opposite side of the hill. It was gruesome work, but it had to be done. The physical labor in the hot sun brought a seemingly simple attitude of disbelief to everyone. They knew this kind of a day might come. They were just struggling to accept it. All 5 of the surviving rangers were wrestling with the same questions. Are we being watched? Will they attack again tonight? How did they pull this off so easily? The difficult job had taken the entire day. Burying Tom was the worst part. Ray cried right in front of the men. There was no way the men were going to stay on Rosary Hill another night. They started walking back to Austin. That was the direction the image of the man was running when Ray tried to shoot him. Ray insisted that every man carry a shield with him. Never before had he seen such a devastating arrow attack. He wanted to make sure nobody else got killed. Ray's pride had received a tremendous blow, but he had to keep going or things could get worse. Now he had to get everyone back to town. The walk back to headquarters was very quiet. Stuttering Henry broke the silence. I am gonna kill Empty Heart. I don't know how, but I am gonna do it. After Henry broke the silence, it seemed everyone had something to say. Billy Terry chimed in. I ain't never seen nothing like that. I was just trying to keep from getting hit by one of them arrows. When it quieted down, everybody was gone. I only fired 2 shots. I didn't even see nothing to shoot at. I just fired anyway. Big Scaly Johnson didn't say anything. Everybody knew that Leo Wilson probably never even came up from underneath his shield, but he spoke anyway. I really don't know what happened. There were so many arrows and gunshots. I never saw anybody. Every step Ray took as he walked back to Austin haunted him. He had to report the deaths, the stolen money, and the failure. He also knew that he was going to have to face William T. Jenkins. That was the worst part of all. Soares Aguilar didn't think the robbery would go as well as it did. His plan worked almost perfectly. Only a few things didn't go right. Morocco, the oldest of the 3 brothers, survived the raid. Soares had planned to kill him in the firefight, but he never got the chance. Another thing that bothered Soares was that he couldn't separate the spirit from one of his victims. He tried to chop off the foot with his hatchet, but the victim was stuck onto a rock pile at an odd angle. Soares had 2 bags full of money and 3 extra handguns. He had used an original Colt Patterson revolver that he bought in Mexico to execute the 2 men in the foxhole. He skillfully crawled up the hill when the arrows and the shooting were terrorizing the Rangers. He saw the foxhole as he got close. It was easy for him to sneak up on them from behind, so he shot both of them in the back of the head. He killed the two men. Then he dismembered them and ran to the wagon to steal the money. On his way back down the hill, he saw Tom Jenkins's body lying up against the rock pile. After taking Tom's gun belt, Soares pulled his hatchet. He attempted to chop off Tom's foot, but then the shooting from the top of the hill started. Soares couldn't risk waiting any longer. He had to run. Soares knew the money was in the wagon because he got information from a state worker in Camp Stockton. Conversation started in a bar about how the state was transporting payroll. Soares kept the tequila flowing and the talk easy. Before long, the drunken employees spilled the beans. Treasury was brought in by the wagon load, and the money was hidden in the baseboard. It was a simple system. Keep a low profile, plan every detail, execute with precision, and bring in the money. Soares had watched one delivery to the Camp Stockton Post personally as he stood disguised as a friendly Mexican. He refined his plan over and over until he had it down pat. He would create complete havoc from four sides in the middle of the night. He would start with launching arrows into the campsite, and he would follow the arrows with gunfire. He knew the victims would be in shock. He would wait a few minutes and repeat the same attack at just the right moment, and then he would personally sneak up the easiest route to the wagon. Morocco was on the other side. He knew when to shoot and when to stop. Kayleigh and Elsu followed his lead. Soares would kill anybody that got in his way. He would get to the wagon and steal the money himself, at least all he could carry. The four bandits would then flee the scene and meet up the next day. But Soares Aguilar had never pulled off a heist like this one. This fortune was bigger than he was expecting. A big man of over 6 feet, he could move and run better than anyone he knew. When it was time to leave the scene, he had few peers. By the time the Rangers knew what was happening, he would be long gone. Ray's shots at him with the Colt Navy revolver came a little too close for comfort, but they were never a real threat. Soares tried to break the money down before the brothers found him the next day. He was going to separate a huge chunk of the cash before he divided it 4 ways. He also had 3 new guns to hide from the brothers. Soares had heard of the gold rush. He now had more than enough money to make the trip and reestablish himself. He didn't care about mining gold. He would just take advantage of those who did. Though he left few clues to his identity, he knew he was now an extremely wanted man. It was time to leave the territory, but first he had to deal with the 3 Apache brothers. All along Soares thought if he could kill Morocco, the oldest and most seasoned brother, he would spare the 2 younger siblings, Kayleigh and Elsu. He thought he could bring the both of them into his own fold. That way, he would have more manpower. He would not worry about a revolt from either of the 2. However, Morocco would always pose as a threat. Morocco was savvy and calculating. He was a lot like Soares himself. The fact that he was alive meant that all 3 had to go. Soares had 3 of the new Colt Navy revolvers. They were all loaded with 6 shots. He had 18 bullets to kill 3 men. If he needed more firepower, he also had his Colt Patterson revolver. Immediately, he had realized how outdated it had become. After retrieving their horses, the 4 outlaws were to meet up at the canyon where they had camped prior to the robbery. Soares had instructed the men to come into the camp separately, but he knew Morocco would find a way to meet up with his brothers. Morocco knew better than to trust Soares. He made a big mistake in letting Soares be the only one to make the run to the wagon. Chapter 7. Soares Aguilar had set up a sniper's perch at the top of the canyon wall. She had never been a particularly good shot. He had questionable eyesight, and he really had never taken much to guns. Now he was in a precarious position. Would he try to shoot all 3 brothers from long range? Would he wait on them to get up close? Would he drop the whole idea and wait on another chance later on down the road? He was a calm man, and his calculated ways had always been his best friend. It was bothering him that he didn't dismember the ranger that was staked into the rock pile. He kept replaying it over and over in his mind that he didn't get the job done. The spiritual belief of dismemberment bothered Soares more than anything. He felt that it made him weak, but he had never gone against it. He was a conflicted man. His half-Mexican, half-Apache blood had always played havoc with his psyche. Being as shrewd and mean as a man could be did little to help his insecure self-image. Another problem started when one of the guards started shooting from the top of the hill. Soares had 2 huge bags draped over his shoulders. One was full of coins. The other was full of paper money. He hammered Tom Jenkins's ankle. The boot was a mess. However, it wasn't close to being separated from his foot. He took off down the hill to a ridge he had planned for cover. Circling back around on Morocco was too far-fetched. That was where he had planned to shoot him. He would then blame it on the Rangers. But it was not to be. There was no way to get to Morocco. Somebody in the camp started shooting at him in the dark. Soares' foot speed got him down the hill and over to the ridge. He regrouped the bags and composed himself. After a quick look for trouble, he took off for the small mountain range close to the Rio Grande. There was one more thing that really bothered Soares. Somewhere along the way, the red tanager feather had come out of his hair. He had other feathers, but he valued every one of them greatly. He wasn't worried about anyone actually finding the feather and putting the whole story together. It just bothered him that he lost it. It helped that the brothers were so unschooled. Their heritage was important to them. They hadn't done much business with any white man. Soares looked different. Most of the Apaches hated Mexicans, but Soares could speak their language. He knew the culture. Morocco struggled with the relationship at first, but he knew he needed to hook up with someone from outside his own world. His people were starting to thin out. He knew he needed knowledge and contacts to survive. He quickly saw how clever Soares really could be. Soares was respectful to them. He knew how to translate their names. Kale, the talented one, was Sparrow. The youngest, Elsu, was the Flying Falcon. He referred to the 2 younger brothers by both of their names. He was trying to educate them, but he only referred to the oldest brother as Morocco. Only once, when the brothers asked if he knew, did he refer to the oldest sibling as White Moon. Ironically, there was no white moon the night of the payroll raid. Soares was planning on the light from the moon to help him find Morocco, but dark, overcast skies made it nearly impossible to see anything. It was good for the raid, but it was bad for Soares' plot to kill Morocco. The 3 Apache brothers met 5 miles away from their meeting point with Soares. All they had to do was find the bison herd. Morocco knew a small Apache tribe that rode the Rio Grande Valley. It was easy for the 3 brothers to find them. Morocco viewed Soares as somewhat of a mentor. He liked him, but he was scared of him. Soares taught him to plan, to think, and to focus on execution of the plan. But Morocco was worried that he was leading his 2 brothers into a trap. He wondered aloud to Kale and Elsu about it. Was the money worth it? They didn't even really know what to do with the money. What if they rode into an ambush? He had learned. Why couldn't they pull off the same crime without Soares? Morocco was trying to influence his 2 brothers only a little more than he was trying to convince himself. "Let's ride in separate from the crossbreed," White Moon said. Kale and Elsu didn't care about the money. They only wanted to make their big brother proud. They would do whatever he told them to do. So, they rode off into the valley and left Soares Aguilar on top of the cliff with all the money. Soares waited on them for a day and a half. He knew they weren't lost. Morocco was too good of a navigator for that. "It is time to leave Texas," he said to himself. He had plenty of money. Now he needed to figure out how to travel with it. It was bulky, and Soares liked to travel light. He knew he had to keep it close to his body. If he didn't, the money could get away from him in an instant. Any common outlaw could tell that the huge bags were odd-looking and probably very valuable. The bag with the paper money was enough trouble, but the bag with the coins was really a problem. The coins chimed as his horse walked. It was obvious what was in the bag to anyone who had any sense. So, Soares made a strategic decision. He dispersed the paper money all around his body and throughout his saddlebags. He even lined some bills into his hat. He accounted for every dollar. He also kept as many coins as possible. However, he decided to bury the rest of the coins in a makeshift grave at the top of the hill. He dug the grave and filled it with rocks. He put a stone and wood marker at the base of the fake grave. Then he took a red feather and tied it into the wood marker with thread he pulled off his shirt. Surely, Morocco would figure out that it was for the brothers. They could dig it up and get their share. If they couldn't figure it out, then that was too bad. Maybe he would come back through the country and dig it up himself some other day. It was a good plan, he thought. He was just interested in one thing now. How would he get to San Francisco? Chapter 8. William T. Jenkins got up every morning and went downtown to Ranger headquarters. Sometimes he would stay around for the entire morning, awaiting word on the mission to Camp Stockton. Other days, he would only stay an hour or so. On this day, he sensed that something was wrong. It was 10 o'clock in the morning when Ray Andrews and the rest of the Rangers walked into town. William T. was one of the first people to see them. He ran straight to the men. "Where's my boy?" he screamed at Ray. Ray didn't have a chance to talk. William T. ran to each Ranger. He grabbed them and shook them. Frantically, he looked for his son. "Where is he?" he screamed. Finally, he realized that his son wasn't with them. William T. dropped to his knees and started crying like a child. It was a horrible scene. The Rangers were led by Colonel John Buckner. He ran to William T. and tried to console him. People started gathering in the early morning Texas sun to see what was happening. The colonel handed William T. off to a junior officer and went straight to Ray. "How many men did we lose?" he asked him. Ray was in shock. He couldn't speak. Things were bad enough before he saw William T. break down. He could barely keep his wits intact. "How many men?" screamed Buckner into Ray's ear. "5 men," chirped stuttering Henry. "5 men. What about the money? Is it gone too?" shouted the colonel. "Money's gone too," spitted Henry. By then, Ray had found a chair in the shade of the front porch at the Ranger headquarters. All of a sudden, he was really sick to his stomach. He wondered if he was dreaming. "This can't be true," he said to himself. But it was true. Empty Heart had not only robbed them of the money, but he had murdered 5 men. William T. broke away from the Ranger who was trying to comfort him and ran straight to Ray. "You son of a bitch," he screamed. Then he started flailing away. He clubbed Ray upside the head 2 or 3 times. "It's your fault, Andrews. It's your fault." Ray just sat there and took it. He didn't know what to say or do. Suddenly, his memory flashed back to the first time he and Tom got into some alcohol. They were just kids. Tom drank so much he could barely walk. Ray dragged him home to the south side of Austin. He knocked on the front door of the Jenkins' house. "William T." answered. All of a sudden, Tom woke up. Right in front of the old man, he blamed everything on Ray. "I told you we shouldn't do it, Ray," he said. "I knew Pop would kill us." It wasn't the first or the last time that Tom would put blame off on Ray. Colonel Buckner pulled William I away. Mr. Jenkins, you have to calm down. You can't attack another man like that." But the damage was done. A man couldn't be lower than Ray Andrews. He crawled on his hands and knees around the corner of the building and started dry heaving. There was nothing in his stomach to vomit. The heavily armed envoy that went to Rosary Hill to retrieve the bodies was without Ray Andrews. The mission went without any conflict at all. Ray attended every funeral but one. He was not permitted to step foot on the grounds of the First Christian Church in Austin during Tom Jenkins' service. He waited around the block and tried to watch everything he could. Then he followed well behind the family on the trip to the cemetery. It was on the east side of town. Colonel Buckner, at the demand of William T. Jenkins, was preparing to court-martial Ray Andrews for neglect of duty. He didn't want to do it, but William T. had a lot of political clout in Austin. He threatened the colonel behind closed doors that Ray Andrews was to get a dishonorable discharge. If that didn't happen, he warned, the colonel himself would be on the chopping block. It turned out that the governor and William I were childhood friends. William T. also wanted jail time for Ray, but that wasn't in the cards. Colonel Buckner fought back on that. If the truth were actually told, it was Colonel Buckner who deserved most of the blame. He had the intelligence on empty heart. He sent the men on the mission knowing full well the risk. Colonel Buckner simply didn't know the best way to haul the payroll through the depths of Southwest Texas. In the end, Ray Andrews was simply discharged from the organization that he loved, the Texas Rangers. He was welcome no more. The colonel wouldn't give in to a dishonorable discharge, but he knew that Ray had to go. William I hit the roof when he found out the results, but he knew deep down that was as far as it would go. He had successfully run Ray Andrews out of the Rangers. Now he wanted to run him out of Austin. It didn't take much. William T. sent a message to Ray through Colonel Buckner. "You need to leave town," it said. "Nobody wants you around here. You have done enough damage already." Ray still had the 10 coins that were stuffed into his boots. He decided to walk over to the funeral home that had buried Tom Jenkins. He asked the owner if William T. had paid the bill. "No, not yet," the undertaker answered. "It isn't customary to pay for at least a week or so." Ray looked into the undertaker's eyes. "How much does he owe you?" He stared back at Ray. "Well, that would be about $15, he whispered. "I'll pay you $8 to clear the bill right now," Ray said sternly. "I would appreciate you working with me." The undertaker looked down at the ground. "Okay, son," he said. "I'll take the $8. Ray pulled the coins out of his boots. "Another thing," Ray grumbled to the undertaker. "You don't tell Mr. Jenkins about this. You tell him that the bill was paid by the Texas Rangers.